Greetings, and from one father to other fathers, let me first begin this video by saying Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. And I really do want to extend that felicitation to all fathers, both those who are transparent in their appeals to scholars, as well as those who might not be so transparent. So, that said, in this video, I'd like to discuss this YouTube community post, which our beloved friend, the good doctor over at We Woke Now, put up back on April 3rd. In that post, he yet again invokes another secret scholar who makes an incredible, tantalizing claim about what appears on the pews. Unfortunately, our friend has yet to share either the scholar's full name or what institution he might be with or his credentials, his field of study. You know, the reader seems to be expected to just accept the claim, perhaps on faith, and this isn't new with the good doctor. But whatever the case, anyone interested in taking a careful look at the post can slow down or pause the video, but I'll also share a link directly to that post in the video description. Now, I briefly discussed the post on Facebook back on April when our friend first put it up, and at the time I expressed an interest in seeing if he would elaborate further in in some sort of forthcoming video or something. And then I raised, the standard concerns. It shares nothing but an email fragment from an unknown scholar, and such a lack of detail or transparency is a problem in light of the how could I put this, the shenanigans which we previously encountered, which previously occurred with the scholars being invoked by that side. I also noted that our friend had not shown the pew allegedly being described or the precise reading behind this description that's being put forth in his post. Now, while I worded that Facebook post somewhat carefully, I had immediately suspected on that day that this new appeal to a scholar might actually be just another bluff. However, I sat quiet, waiting for the good doctor to elaborate, as I said, in a subsequent video. But after about 2.5 months, there has yet to be any follow-up. So in this video, I'd like to go ahead and share my actual thoughts on this subject. And these are the thoughts that I've had since April 3rd when I first saw that YouTube community post. Now, before we look at the details of that community post, permit me to share what I think might be a relevant bit of background information. You see, 9 days before our friend put that community post up, I had put up a video which posed a question to him on the subject of appeals to scholars and the possibility of Arabic appearing on the pews. So I'm going to play a little less than a minute from that video, as I think the question which was posed in that video likely sets the context of the YouTube community post, which came a little over a week later and which we're going to discuss in this video. Okay, here. But, here's a question I'd like to ask Dr. Kelly. How could 3 different scholars, independently of each other, arrive at al-Nas as a possible reading?
You don't know. You're not a doctor.
Remember that Cambridge's Geoffrey Khan concluded that al-Nas appeared. Samar Ali and Mahan Mirza somewhat more hesitatingly offered al-Nas as a possibility. Dr. Kelly claims I manipulated those different professors. But remember, unlike his team, I didn't suggest any letters. I didn't suggest any specific text. So that raises the question, how could 3 different men arrive at the same string of characters independently of one another? The honest answer is that the relevant markings look like the relevant string of characters. What appears on that pew does look somewhat like al-Nas. Okay, and we're back. And now, with that clip in mind, let's take a closer look at our friend's YouTube community post, which went up a little more than a week later, seemingly as a timely reply to the question which was asked in that clip. Now, I'm just going to focus on the first paragraph of the caption. So what you see here is a truncated version of his post. More specifically, I'm going to focus on the first 3 sentences of that first paragraph of the caption, and then the email excerpt which appears in the appended image. So the opening 3 lines of the caption read as follows, quote, "Listed below is one of several professors who are astute in the Near Eastern languages. This particular team was sent 15 high-definition quality photos of some of the pews. This is their partial response explaining the language they see and why it resembles Arabic," end quote. All right. Remember that last portion at the end there about how this is, explains why something resembles Arabic. We're going to touch on that in this video. But moving on, then we get to the image of this post, the appended image, which has this apparent email fragment allegedly, describing the markings found on a pew. So this is supposedly some unknown scholar who wrote this. And this email fragment reads as follows, quote, is ancient Amharic written in Ge'ez or Ethiopic. This is a South Semitic language. Biblical Hebrew is Northwest Semitic. Amharic was the language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and interacted with South Arabian, thus it looks Arabian. End quote. Now, I saw at least 4 points which collectively lead me to fear that this might be a bluff, and which is to say that this might not be an actual statement from an actual scholar familiar with Semitic languages, much less, more specifically, Ethiopian Semitic languages. So let's go through those 4 points. First, there is a minor point of concern, which is the awkward reference to quote-unquote ancient Amharic. Now, I want to put emphasis on the word minor, which is to say that in a vacuum, this need not be a big deal, but when considered together with the other points I'm going to bring up, it's at least worth considering. So it's my understanding that our earliest extant readings in the Amharic language are, that they date to the Middle Ages, more specifically, a range somewhere between the 12th to 14th centuries. Therefore, if the unseen markings are being compared to ancient Amharic rather than, say, modern or medieval forms of Amharic, it begs the question, what precisely are they being compared to? Now, admittedly, you can find people out there who use the phrase, quote unquote, ancient Amharic, but most of them are misusing the word ancient in that regard, or at least they're using it awkwardly. The rare exception is the occasional scholar of Ethiopian Semitic languages who might allude to attempts to reconstruct what Amharic looked like in antiquity based on, for example, old forms which appear in the writings of medieval Ethiopian scholars, like, for example, grammarians who discuss Amharic, or is for that matter. For me, this phrase is more reminiscent of, or suspiciously reminiscent of, the less than careful terminology which has been employed by our friends over there, like Kelly Richardson, Will Brown, who, for example, had previously referred to quote-unquote ancient cursive Hebrew appearing on the pews, and more recently said that those who are proposing Arabic on the pews are proposing more specifically quote-unquote ancient Arabic. But like I said, this is a minor point. However, I'm going to circle back to this in my next point. So the second point of concern comes with the reference to, quote, Amharic written in Ge'ez, end quote. Now, this is a major point of concern for me, as they're not just referring to a script, rather they're identifying a specific language. Note that multiple languages have historically been written in the Ge'ez script, such as Ge'ez itself, as well as Amharic, Tigrinya, and others. Here specifically Amharic is being identified in the markings on some unseen pew. Now, our friend or friends, I don't know how to put it, but our friend over at We Woke Now had previously claimed that certain individual Ge'ez characters appeared on the pews, and he was also later on quite excited when the scholar Ephraim Isaac proposed that some markings resemble individual Ge'ez characters. But note that one can't distinguish one language from another based on mere individual characters floating in decontextualized isolation. Let's see. Consider this analogy to help illustrate this. Suppose you saw the Latin characters P and N. Now, suppose you were asked to identify what language is present. Is it English or Spanish? Perhaps French or Italian or Latin? What language is there? The reality is that you don't have enough information to identify what language is present if you just have a couple of, like I said, decontextualized individual characters. However, if instead of those, mere 2 characters or whatever, if instead of that you had a more complex string of characters forming a phrase like paternoster, at that point you would be able to say that it's Latin. And alternatively, if you found a different string of characters which read Padre Nuestro, that could be identified as Spanish. The point of the analogy is that in order for a specific language to be identified, a complex string of successive characters is needed. So, in order for the secret scholar invoked by We Woke Now to have found specifically Amharic rather than, for example, Ge'ez or Tigrinya or some other Ethiopian language, in order for them to find specifically Amharic, they would likewise have needed a complex enough string of characters to produce at least a word which is distinct to Amharic. Something that's found in Amharic and not in Ge'ez or Tigrinya. So, too, this brings us back to the previous point about it being identified as more specifically ancient Amharic. To distinguish an Amharic word or phrase as ancient rather than medieval or modern, again, you would need a complex string of characters forming something that's distinct to ancient forms, distinct to antiquity, to allow you to distinguish it from, medieval and modern forms. So, now think about it. Surely, if they had such a complex string of Ge'ez characters that they amounted to a distinct word or phrase in Amharic, and specifically ancient Amharic, wouldn't they have shown such an incredible find by now? For them to imply such a tantalizing find without showing it for months is honestly, it's reminiscent of how last year they claimed that David Bunis found a complex Hebrew sentence in the Solitreo script, and in fact, they even gave an English translation of that alleged sentence, but they never showed the relevant Hebrew sentence itself. So, too, they claimed a secret Hebrew scholar named Richard Katz had found a clear Hebrew phrase on a pew, but again, never showed the markings where that phrase is found. And so, and those claims turned out to be bluffs. And honestly, with all due respect, this new claim from last April gives the strong impression that it too is likely a mere bluff. Again, they are implying that a scholar found a string of Ge'ez characters so complex as to identify it as specifically Amharic and ancient Amharic to boot, yet they have gone months without showing that string of Ge'ez characters. At the very least, that is highly suspicious, especially in light of their past attempts to appeal to scholars. But let's move on to the third point of concern, that being the statement that, quote, Amharic was the language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, end quote. Now, let me say up front that this is another minor point of concern, emphasis on minor. By itself, this need not be a major issue. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that the liturgical language of the Tewahedo Church, what's called the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, was and is Ge'ez. Now, yes, today, beyond the liturgy, all over Ethiopia, sermons are given in Amharic, at least in Amharic-speaking areas. But appealing to that fact would leave one to wonder why it was stated that Amharic was the language of the church, as if in the past tense. We are to believe that this email fragment was written by a scholar, or perhaps a team of scholars based on the caption, who were familiar enough with Ethiopian languages as to find specifically Amharic appearing in the pews, yet the uncareful use of terms in that email gives the impression that it might have been typed by someone perhaps not all that familiar with the topic. Now, again, I fully concede that this by itself is a minor point, but the statement strikes me as suspiciously sloppy and thus worth considering together with the other points of concern. So with that, let's move on to the fourth point of concern, which is another major point of concern, and that is the claim that this yet-to-be-shown Amharic text was mistaken for Arabic because it is related to South Arabian and thus looks like Arabic. Now, recall the background I had mentioned earlier. This community post by the good doctor went up mere days after I had posed this question to him. How is it possible that three different scholars, independently of each other, could arrive at suggesting the same string of Arabic characters, the same Quranic phrase, ilahin nas, suggesting that that might appear on the same single pew, one specific pew? Now, I argued that the best explanation is that the relevant markings do at least look like that Arabic phrase, even if only coincidentally so. The timing, of this YouTube community post coming right on the heels of that question, the timing made our friend's community post seem like an indirect reply, almost as if to say it's actually Amharic, but it can be mistaken for Arabic because Amharic is related to South Arabian and thus looks Arabic. Or perhaps even more sloppily, it looks Arabian, quote unquote Arabian rather than Arabic. But, whatever the case, there is a problem here. Yes, Amharic, like other Semitic languages in Ethiopia, is related to Arabic. They have similarities in grammars and vocabularies. And, separate from that or aside from that, Amharic is written in the Ge'ez script, and that script does descend from the South Arabian script. But the problem is that the now standard Arabic script does not look like the South Arabian script or the Ge'ez script. Ge'ez and South Arabian, the Ge'ez and the Musnad script, what's called the South Arabian script, they look alike because Ge'ez descends from the Musnad script. Ge'ez descends from the South Arabian script. But neither of those two scripts look like the Arabic script that's now standard, the Arabic script that became dominant once the Quran was written in it. So consider this visual example. At the top, you have the relevant Quranic phrase, which multiple people, multiple scholars, but also some non-scholars, proposed as a possibility for one of the pews. And that phrase is the Arabic phrase, ilahin nas, written in the now standard Arabic script. Some might want to call it the Hijazi script, but even that can be potentially confusing. Below that is the same phrase transcribed in the corresponding characters of the South Arabian script, the Musnad script. And then below that is the pronunciation of that phrase transcribed using Amharic's approach to the Ge'ez script. So again, while the Amharic and Ge'ez languages are related to the Arabic language, and separate from that, the Ge'ez script is derived from the South Arabian script, if you have an Amharic phrase in the Ge'ez script, it is nigh impossible for someone to confuse that with an Arabic phrase written in what is the now standard Arabic script, the now dominant Arabic script. It just seems to me impossible that you're going to visually confuse Amharic written in the Ge'ez script for standard Arabic or classical Arabic. So in short, the statement seems like the sloppy work of a mind which was poorly informed on what's being referred to. It seems like the author confused script and language while attempting to address the question which was posted mere days before this community post went up. In short, it seems like a bluff. However, if it's not a bluff, I'd love to see this alleged string of Ge'ez characters, which produces specifically Amharic terminology, yet can also somehow be visually mistaken for Arabic written in the now mainstream Arabic script. But alas, our beloved friend, the good doctor, has not yet shared the markings which contain that string of characters. And I must confess, just as I was confident last November that they could not produce a pew with a string of Hebrew characters giving rise to the sentence they attributed to David Bunis, so too here I'm confident that they cannot produce a pew with a string of Ge'ez characters justifying the claims being attributed to this new secret scholar. And, anticipating that some might object that, just because they didn't show these amazing readings, that doesn't mean they therefore don't have them. I would invite those who raise that objection to ask themselves this question: why keep such amazing finds secret? Why hide them from the public? Wouldn't it be more auspicious, would it be better to just simply bring these amazing findings out into the public and basically shut down the question, end the debate over whether language appears on the pews? Because it seems to me that these amazing finds would close the debate. But for some reason, they're keeping, their cards close to their chest on this, and they're sharing lesser lights, harder. They're sharing claims that are harder to take seriously. But so I would also ask this question: are you open to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the precise markings are not being shared because they might just be bluffing? That maybe they don't actually have these strings of characters that are being attributed to some unshown pew? It's food for thought, and I'll let each viewer decide for themselves. On that note, I'm going to close this video here again by wishing all the fathers out there a very happy Father's Day. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.
There was no scholarship! What do you mean there was no scholarship? I